Okay, if y'all all do me a favor, if you would open up your bulletins and look where it says sermon. Okay? That sermon title will make absolutely no sense after you have listened to this sermon. Not that it makes much sense now either. And I have to apologize for that. It's not that Donna or anyone else in the production of this bulletin screwed up. It was I screwed up. When I was originally planning for this sermon today, that was the title of the sermon I was going to preach. But then I started writing it, and I found out that I wrote an entirely different sermon than the one I had planned on preaching. So it's a completely different sermon title. I don't even know if this one has a sermon title. Originally, I was going to talk about the second tablet of the law, or what we call the Ten Commandments, and about how it relates to our neighbors, and the positive and the negative aspects of that. So for the last couple of weeks, we have been talking about what are traditionally called the Ten Commandments. I suggested that rather than thinking of them as commandments, it would be better if we think about them as words. God's sacred words to the people of Israel and to us. We talked about Abraham Heschel, who once said that words create worlds. These sacred words that came from God to the people of Israel and to us are intended to create the world God intends for us. And they give us that picture, and they give us a challenge. And the challenge is that if the world in which we live has not been created by the words that God has given us, then we are called to be critical of that world. We're called to be critical of people who use words that give a different vision of the world than God intends. So we also, when we were talking about these commandments, these laws, these words, we talked about trying to envision them on two tablets, right? Even though in Exodus it is not very clear that these tablets of stone were written in the form of two, it is very clear by things like Charlton Heston and Mel Brooks that there are two tablets. Not three, but two. And if you get that joke, I really want to hear from you later. It helps us to think about them in two tablets. And the first four of the words on the first tablet are those words which are related to how we connect or how we are connected to God. The second tablet, the second set of words, are those words which deal with how we relate to our neighbors. Now, for the past few weeks, as we have been looking at the commandments, or the words, we've had the same reading from the Gospel of Matthew each week. Has anybody picked up on that yet? I'm about to say, some of y'all got to really pay more attention if you haven't picked up on that yet. Same one every week, and it is the case in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus is asked, which is the greatest commandment? And his response is a little confusing, as we talked about, because it's not just a single great commandment. It seems that he gives two commandments for that single great commandment. And he says the first is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your mind. And the second is like it. So the first, love the Lord your God, all your heart, all your mind. First table of the law. How we connect with God. The first four sacred words. The second, he says, is like it. Do unto others as you would have them, and do unto you. Yes. How you treat neighbors. Second table of the law. How we relate to others. First table, God. Love the Lord your God. Second table, neighbors. Do unto others. There's a story about a rabbi who lived just a few years before Jesus, and a Gentile, a non-Jew, came to the rabbi and said, Rabbi, I want to be Jewish. I want to convert to Judaism. What must I do? No, wait. Here's an idea. If you can teach me all of the Torah, all of the laws of Judaism, while I stand on one foot, then I will convert to Judaism. The rabbi took a moment and looked at him and said, that which you hate, do not do to your neighbor. The rest is commentary. Go and study. That's kind of like the negative version of the golden rule. Do unto others. He says do not, but in the New Testament it says do. And that was going to be kind of the original spin on things about that negative and positive aspect of how we relate to our neighbors, that second table of the law. But instead, we're still going to talk about the second table of the law, but we're going to talk about it in terms of the Sabbath, with an emphasis on the Sabbath. The Sabbath day is that command. We didn't read about it this week, but we did last week. It is that on 6 days you will work, but the seventh day shall be a Sabbath unto your Lord. It's a day of rest. And that day of rest is important because it is that day of rest that we have in common with our Lord. If you look at that commandment about Sabbath, we are commanded to keep the Sabbath because the Lord our God worked 6 days in creation, and on the seventh day rested. And so we too should have that day of rest. That day of rest is a common ground that we have between our Lord and ourselves. That day of rest is the connection between those two tables of the law. We ought to have that in common with God, a day of rest. Now I say we ought to have that in common with God, not because God forgets to rest, but because we forget to rest. We forget that sacred word of Sabbath and the importance of a day of rest. We live in this society where that's founded on that Protestant work ethic, right? Where we have sayings like idle hands or the devil's play shop, right? Think about success for a minute. How many people do you know in our country who we deem to be successful that brag about taking it easy? To be successful in our country, people brag about being busy. How many leaders have you heard brag about being able to get 10 to 12 hours of sleep a night? Not very many. Most of them brag about how little sleep they get each night. We live in a society that doesn't value people who seem to do very little. It is very difficult for us to rest. And if you don't believe me, ask someone who is about to retire what they are planning to do next. 9 times out of 10, they'll tell you they're trying to figure out what to do in order to stay busy. We've worked our whole lives. It's time to retire. Let's find something else to keep ourselves busy. We don't like to rest. And some people will argue, no, I'm too busy to find time to rest. I have too much going on. We like to brag about how busy we are. And so there's too much going on for us to be able to find time to rest. Well, if you ever find yourself in those shoes, or if you talk to someone who brags about being too busy to find time to rest, talk to them about Desmond Tutu. Do y'all know Desmond Tutu? Desmond Tutu is many things. Besides being a black Anglican priest who was the bishop of Johannesburg, South Africa during apartheid, he is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He has had over 100 honorary degrees given to him from universities and countries all around the world. He has had more speaking engagements in more countries than I have ever visited cities. He has been a very busy man. And yet Desmond Tutu always found time to rest. The story is that in the mornings, the door to his office would be locked until noon. No one was allowed in. No phone calls were answered, no matter what. Because that was his time of sacred rest, his time of prayer, of being with God. Now, if Desmond Tutu can find the time to find rest, any of the rest of us can. That rest ought to be the commonality that we share with God. The sacred words of God that deal with how we connect with one another and how we connect with God are rooted in that idea of Sabbath. Sabbath is important. It is important not only for us as individuals, but it is given to us also as a responsibility for the community around us. If you look at that Sabbath command, it is a command or a word that comes to us and says that not only shall this be a day of rest for you, it shall be a day of rest for your daughter, your son, your male, your female servant, all of your animals, and the resident alien living among you. Even your animals get a day off. This is an entire economic concept. The concept of Sabbath deals with an entire economy, an entire community. To really appreciate this, we have to think about what the Israelite people have just been going through. When God gives them this command about Sabbath, this sacred word, which, by the way, if you notice when you're looking at the entire bits about what God says from the mountain, the Sabbath bit gets the most airtime, according to Walter Brueggemann. And he's right. Because the Sabbath bit talks about not only us as individuals, but the entire community. Because this community of people, the children of Israel, are coming out of Egypt. They are coming out of slavery. They are coming out of Pharaoh's economy. Pharaoh's economy, which said enough is never enough. As slaves, they never got a day off. They were even given more tasks to do for Pharaoh so that Pharaoh could get more and more and more. There was no time for a break, no time to rest and to honor God. Pharaoh's economy was built very much like the pyramids themselves. All right, so think about the pyramids. Anyone ever been to the pyramids? I figured Mark would say yes. I just knew that. Mark's been everywhere. The pyramids have these huge bases, tiny tops. Huge bases built for one man by an entire economy for one man. That was indicative of Pharaoh's system. Pharaoh owned everything, and yet still Pharaoh wanted the people to work. Pharaoh took advantage of the people because he could. Because Pharaoh said, enough is never enough. But God's economy, the economy of the Sabbath, tells us when enough is enough. It tells us that, yes, enough is enough. God's economy is an economy of the Sabbath that doesn't scramble and scrabble around, needing more and more all the time. Sabbath, when it's for you and for me and for the entire world, is a whole different economy. An economy of Sabbath says not only that we give ourselves time to rest and recuperate and focus on God, it means that we give our neighbor time to rest and recuperate and focus on God. It means that those people who we think maybe are a little bit less than us because they got to work a little harder, we give them time to rest and recuperate and focus on God. I mean, a Sabbath economy means that we allow the grace for people to take a rest. It means that we parents today, who often find out how important it is to schedule our children for every waking minute of the day, we need to allow ourselves and our children that space for Sabbath. The Sabbath economy is a whole new way of doing things, especially for the Israelite people who have been coming out of Pharaoh's economy. Walter Brueggemann talks about Pharaoh's economy as an economy of anxiety, where enough is never enough. Whereas God's economy, God's Sabbath economy, is not an economy of anxiety, but an economy of life. An economy of freedom. An economy of life instead of death. An economy of liberation rather than exploitation. An economy that is completely different. He says that in the economy of Sabbath, when you have that time to rest, when you have that time to reflect on God, it is no longer an exploitative system. It is a system of liberation, a system of life instead of death. And according also to Walter, he says that those who are caught up in the system of death, if they're not in the Sabbath system, are bound to dishonor parents and all non-productive kin. They are bound to be engaged in killing violence because others are seen as a threat. They are bound to reduce a sexual interaction to exploitative commodity. They are bound to usurp from others if it is something that they want. They are bound to engage in distortion and euphemism in order to gain advantage. They are bound to be committed to acquiring goods. Whereas, says Brueggemann, you who keep Sabbath do not need to dishonor mother and father. You do not need to kill. You do not need to commit adultery. You do not need to steal. You do not need to bear false witness. You do not need to covet. You do not need to do these things because you are able to depart from an exploitative system. The sacred word to keep the Sabbath is a word that connects us with God. At least it ought to. And when we keep the Sabbath, it is not just for ourselves. It is in order to change an anxious system. If words create worlds, the word of Sabbath is intended to create a world where the weak are not taken advantage of, where we are free to live as equals among one another, where we are reminded constantly of what we have in common with our God. That is the world of Sabbath. And that Sabbath reminds us how we live